Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first fully virtual seminar for the year for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I'm Laura Rosick, and I direct the center, and we're really pleased to have so many of you join us here today. A little bit of housekeeping is your cameras and microphones have been disabled. Any questions you have, please go through the Q&A function, and we will answer questions at the end. So we'll have a few announcements right now. Our lecture from Professor Chandra, and then some questions. I wanted to highlight a few of our upcoming lectures. One that is a different time than normal is Monday, October 25th from 9:30 to 11, a roundtable on the past, present, and future of LGBT activism in Singapore, a roundtable on Pink Dot. We're really excited for that. As well, we're extremely excited on Friday, November 5th to have Alyssa Paradis, who is an LSA Collegiate Fellow in Anthropology, come and talk to us a little bit about the Philippines. It's the Philippines, Asia's Banana Republic, vertical disintegration after empire. And we're happy to have her come in and have that talk that day. Again, likely to be, overwhelmingly likely to be fully virtual. So please join us for that talk. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors here today, the International Institute and the Department of Asian Languages and Culture. And as always, we are grateful for funding from the U.S. Department of Education, National Resource Center for this grant, or for the funds for this talk. I also wanted to quickly thank the staff who have made this seminar possible, and especially have Jonathan Valdez maybe turn on his camera and give a little wave. Those of you in the center know that we've been without a program specialist, and Jonathan is joining us remotely from the West Coast, and will, at the end of the month, will be joining us in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I wanted you to see his face, and we are happy and excited to have him join us. And with that, we were just saying that in the pandemic, we so often talk about how great it is to have people from across the world. And for this seminar series, we're having somebody from down the street. And we're really happy to have our friend Siddharth Chandra join us here today from Michigan State University, where he's a professor in the James Madison College. He directs MSU's Asian Studies Center and is working with us on quite a few initiatives with our program. We just had a student who came from MSU to our MERS program, and we have a lot more than I would have thought, Siddharth, a lot of joint students taking classes with the Big Ten initiative. So we're happy that we're more formalizing and we get our relationship and get to hear from him today. I'm especially excited because although Siddharth is an economist, most of his research includes looking at behavior and policy relating to addictive substances, but really he works at the intersection of economics, health, and history. And he does have a courtesy appointment in the MSU's departments of epidemiology and biostatistics. So a lot of his work is really up my alley. I did also want to highlight something that I've used in some of my teaching, which are some BBC World videos that he has on the Spanish flu and pandemic, the story of the 1918 flu in Indonesia and India. If you're interested after this talk, check those out. I use them when I teach, and I think they're really interesting. A little bit more housekeeping. Professor Chandra received his Ph.D. in economics from Cornell, master's in economics from the University of Chicago, and a BA in economics from Brandeis. Before he came to Michigan State, he was the director of the Asian Studies Center at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And we hope him joining us virtually today is one of many times we'll have him here on campus and be able to talk about joint programs and initiatives, and even more importantly, our research in Southeast Asia. So Siddharth, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm delighted to be here. This is, collaborations, I think, between MSU and the University of Michigan. We should have so many more than we do. We were just discussing behind the scenes how, sometimes, unfortunately, inertia takes over. And I'm truly delighted that, we have more and more going on in collaboration with each other. I'd also like to extend, I do direct the Asian Studies Center here at MSU. I'd like to extend an open invitation to scholars in this room who work on any part of Asia, Southeast Asia included, but also East, South, Central, West Asia. If you have research that's interesting on any of these regions in the world and would like to sort of get feedback on it, like to exchange it with colleagues at Michigan State, we'd love to bring you in either virtually or in person to give talks here. So please do get in touch. We'd love to increase more of this collaboration in the future. So thank you again for the invitation. And as I think was advertised, the topic of my talk today is going to be the 1918 influenza pandemic in Indonesia and comparisons with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I'm actually going to focus on the 1918 influenza pandemic. I'm going to focus on how it played out in Indonesia. I will occasionally bring in comparisons closer to home, especially Michigan. I've done a little bit of related research on Michigan and maybe some other locations in the United States. And then, where I think it's relevant that there are just so many parallels, I'll also bring up parallels with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So with that said, I'm going to do a screen share. I'm going to go into presentation mode. And I think I need to change the display setting. There we go. So that it's right in front of me. Okay. So this is the title of my talk. Hopefully, can everybody see it? If you can just do a thumbs up, somebody. So I know you can see the slide. I'll get started.
Looks good, Siddharth. You look great.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. So the aims of this presentation, this is going to be a broad kind of overview presentation. We can, of course, go into more depth during the Q&A session. The aim is to describe key features of the influenza pandemic of 1918 as it played out in Indonesia. In those days, Indonesia was known as the Dutch East Indies. It was a Dutch colony. And then to compare the 1918 pandemic with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And you'll probably see comparisons where I don't explicitly make them just because there are so many. So let me start with some basic features of the pandemic. Some leading epidemiologists have referred to the 1918 flu pandemic as the mother of all pandemics. And what they really meant there was the virus that caused the 1918 flu, the H1N1, actually produced descendants that produced repeated pandemics in the future. So the 1918 pandemic may have been the worst flu pandemic in recent history. It certainly wasn't the only one. We had subsequent ones in the middle of the century and towards the end of the century. Okay, and right there's a possible parallel with COVID-19, which I hope doesn't come to pass. But in the same breath, almost, scholars have referred to the 1918 pandemic as the forgotten pandemic. So Alfred Crosby, a very famous geographer who wrote on the pandemic, who unfortunately passed away in 2018, the centennial of that pandemic, referred to it as the forgotten pandemic. And it really was a forgotten pandemic until about 2020, when COVID-19 came along. People who research infectious diseases did resurrect the specter of the 1918 pandemic in 2018. It's sort of 100th anniversary, but it was only in 2020 that the 1918 pandemic really started attracting attention. Why? It was a global pandemic, a lot like COVID-19. It was manifested in 1, 2, 3, or 4 waves, depending on which part of the world you were in. The global death toll is estimated to have been at approximately 50 million, which is really staggering. We don't have a good idea of what the death toll was, but this is sort of a very broad estimate and a widely accepted one. And in Java, our research has shown that the loss in population exceeded 4 million. I should clarify, though, because our research has been misquoted in many, many places. When we talk about population loss, we are not just talking about deaths. We're also talking about babies that were not born who likely would have been born under normal circumstances. I'll get into that in some detail in a future slide. Okay, so I'm going to look at 4 themes here. The first theme is the historical theme. In Indonesia, you have to understand the colonial context. Indonesia was part of a colonial sort of global trading system. It was connected to the colonial power, the Netherlands, but there was also a lot of trade going on with neighboring colonies, including what was then British Malaya, British India, and colonies to the east as well, right? And so as you might expect, the pandemic actually came to Indonesia through ports. The first outbreak was observed in Sumatra, in the northern coast of Sumatra. For those of you who know the geography, that's on the very busy Straits of Malacca. And there's a lot of shipping going across from the Malay Peninsula to Sumatra in the early 20th century. And in Java also, it entered through ports. I'll show you that in more detail later on. Another very important aspect of the pandemic to understand how it plays out is the state of health administration. There was a very, very weak health system in place in the Dutch East Indies at the time. In fact, the 1918 pandemic helped to mobilize Dutch authorities to create a much more efficient burgerlijke geneeskundige dienst, which is the civil health service as a consequence of the pandemic. We're also looking at a stratified society and unfortunately, therefore, stratified outcomes. So if you look at how, for example, the Dutch authorities collected data, it was always in this three-tiered system where you had Europeans at the top, you had what they call vreemd Oosterlingen or other foreign Asiatics or Orientals or whatever term you want to use at the time, that those are actually English translations that you see in the documents. And then below that, they had the inlanders who were the indigenous people, right? And so the society was stratified. It was stratified politically and economically. And as a consequence, nutritional factors played a very important role in determining who was going to survive and who was not going to survive during the pandemic. Okay, so there was a very strong relationship to nutrition based on your socioeconomic status. Here's one example of the stratification. Here I'm making a comparison actually with Amsterdam, with the sort of, the capital of the colonial, if you will, the metropole. Let me just start up a pen, right? So these are the data for 7 different weeks, 7 consecutive weeks of the epidemic, right? When the epidemic was peaking in different locations. So one is Amsterdam, the colonial capital. One is Magelang division, which is in central Java, for those of you who don't know the geography of Java. And Krasak is actually a sub-district within Magelang, okay? It turns out a health officer, P.B. van Steenis, wrote one of the most detailed epidemiologic accounts of what was happening in the pandemic. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to translate it and to be able to understand what he's talking about. So here's the important point, though. The important point is the annualized influenza mortality rate in Amsterdam peaks in the 5th week of the pandemic and is 40.3 people per 1,000, right? On an annualized basis, okay? So just think of that as a number showing the severity of the pandemic in Amsterdam at its peak. Look at what happens in Magelang. It's 6 times as bad, right? And if you go to Krasak, which is a sub-district in Magelang, it's twice as bad then again as Magelang, right? So as the entire division. So in some senses, you can think of the pandemic as being 6 times as severe, at least in terms of mortality impacts in Magelang, in Java, as it was in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. Okay? And some of this very, very likely we see from qualitative accounts had to do with the nutritional status of people in Java compared to Amsterdam, and also compared to other locations in Indonesia, okay? So, right here, we see some very interesting questions that relate to COVID-19, right? There's a lot of talk of disparities in health outcomes. Has the pandemic affected different people differently? Has nutrition played a role in COVID-19 outcomes? We know for a fact that it played an extremely important role in the 1918 influenza. There is some sense that people with metabolic conditions, which are sometimes driven by nutrition imbalances, have been affected much more severely than people who don't have those kinds of conditions. So you can make an argument, at least in terms of a distal kind of effect, that nutrition played an important role. And of course, connectivity, right? Today, the world is so much more interconnected than it was previously. And as a consequence, you've actually seen the spread of the pandemic, usually through air routes of transportation. Okay. So let's move on to geography. This is another very interesting theme that has attracted the attention of many pandemic scholars. And of course, one of the first questions is, did the 1918 influenza enter through particular locations, enter any particular place? Did it follow transportation routes? And what are some of the other factors with which the spread pattern of influenza might have been associated? So I'm going to show you what we know about Java. Now, keep in mind, the data are quite scarce, and you really have to hunt around to find information that can prove any kinds of points that you're trying to make or you're trying to disprove, right? All right. So let's talk about the entry point in Indonesia. As I mentioned, it starts off in the northern part of Sumatra, Sumatra Utara, currently the location of Medan, which is a very large city. It comes from Malaysia, from which in turn receives it from Great Britain through the colonial network. Okay. In Java, the entry points are on the northern coast of Java, and there are large cities on the northern coast of Java. One entry point is Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies at the time, now known as Jakarta. The other is Semarang, which is another very large city on the northern coast of central Java. Okay. So one of the things we did in our research is we actually looked at data on deaths. We had monthly data for all of the different locations in Java, the different sub-districts here. And we used them to compute weekly estimates of how many people were dying at different points in time during the pandemic. And using that, we actually took each of those weekly estimates and we asked the question, for each of these districts, which week is the peak week? Okay. And so if on the map you see a brown colored district, like this one here, for example, that means that district is going through the peak during the pandemic. The week of October 1918 is the peak week for this location. All right. If it's a dark red, it's the second highest week, so it's close to the peak. If it's orange, it's the third highest. If it's yellow, it's the fourth highest. And if it's white, it's not a peak week. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I actually have maps for every single week. I'm not going to show you all of them. I'm just going to jump month by month. So this is what we see in October 2019-18, which is early on in the pandemic in Java. And what you see is Jakarta and the Semarang area have already flared up. And in fact, it's moved to a little bit to the east of that region. Now look at what happens about a month later. In early November, it's spread across, it's basically radiated outward from those areas. Remember, this was one entry point and this was another entry point, right? So it's radiated out to other localities. This, of course, the area that I'm currently mousing over is the location of Surabaya, another major city and a port in the Dutch East Indies. Another approximately month, 3 weeks later, and it's now moved to much more remote areas of Java, which are the southern coast, right? Relatively remote. And then also the central part of central Java. And then finally, the exit points, if there is such a thing as an exit point on an island like Java, are some of the more remote districts on the southern coast. Okay, so a very clear pattern. It enters through ports and it basically radiates outward and moves down to the south. Okay, we have another very interesting account. This goes back to P.B. van Steenis, the health officer whom I quoted, whom I mentioned earlier, who produced that nice table. We can look at what's happening inland. So we actually have a very detailed account of what happens in the Kabupaten of Magelang, the district of Magelang. And the account tells us that Magelang is located just to the north and west of the city of Yogyakarta, which, if you know Indonesia, is a major metropolis in central Java, on the southern part of central Java, right? And what we learn is that Yogyakarta during the time of the pandemic was facing a food shortage. And the reason was quite clear. It was a devastating pandemic. Farmers were getting hit left and right. And as a result, food was not making it to the market, right? Produce. And in many instances, it was actually rotting in the field, right? So people from Yogyakarta were beginning to move outward into areas that were not affected by the pandemic in search of pasars or bazaars where they could find food. And Magelang, being an unfortunate neighbor of Yogyakarta, unfortunate at that time, right? Ended up being one of the areas where there were bazaars to which people were coming. Muntelan is another intermediate town between Magelang and Yogyakarta on the main road. That also gets affected. We have an account that clearly suggests that there are some super spreader events going on at these bazaars and that the pandemic is moving along major roads. So another thing that we did is, so here's a quote from P.B. van Steenis, and it's very clear he's saying that, with few exceptions, it appears that the outbreak starts close to the large markets, the bazaars. These are your super spreader type events, right? The markets, run twice a week and are visited by thousands of people. Those are the actual events, right? And they're in very close proximity to each other. There could be no better opportunity to allow the infection to spread quickly and effectively, right? So this is a very clear idea, and this should sound very familiar to you, right? This is the 1918 version of super spreader events. Okay, the other thing that Van Steenis does is he actually provides in writing a week-by-week account of where influenza cases are being observed, and then when locations become super spreader type locations, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go down the page. So this is the week ending the 10th of October. And what you see is there's not a whole lot going on in Magelang. Keep in mind that the road from Yogyakarta comes up north and west from the southeast. Okay, so this is the main road. This is that market Muntilan that I mentioned earlier. This is Magelang. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to page down now. This is the week ending October 17, and what you see is Muntilan and Magelang have cases of influenza reported. Okay, in the following week, the bazaars that are just off the main road get affected. And then there's another bazaar that seems to be off this main road, the one that goes down to the city of Purworejo, that gets infected. And now you see some of the earlier bazaars that were affected have become centers of outbreaks, okay? So now it's spreading from these centers. And more bazaars more locations along the main road going down to Purworejo are reporting infections, okay? And then finally, it starts moving north as well. So now you have some villages in the northern areas begin to light up. And one of the beautiful things about this map is the topography. You see the volcanoes, right? So this is mountainous country as well. And what you'll see is in the final weeks, it begins to go out and you have centers of spread that in the more remote and mountainous areas, okay? So this is sort of a very clear picture that this is how the virus is spreading. It's clearly spreading through human contact. And there's sort of a timeline for the dissipation of the virus through human populations, okay? And of course, you know, these are really rhetorical questions at this point, but you can ask very similar questions about the geography of the spread of COVID-19 through the United States or the world or any other location. Okay, let's move on to demography. This is truly a fascinating subject, right? And one of the sort of very unusual features of the 1918 influenza was its disproportionate impact on specific age groups. Okay, now this should sound very familiar to you with COVID-19 too, right? If you remember, when COVID-19 first came, it disproportionately hit people sort of in the elderly age categories, right? 65 and up. And that's why when the vaccine first came out, we prioritized those segments of the population. Well, it turns out the 1918 influenza also had a disproportionate impact on certain age groups, except that the age groups were very different, okay? So now I'm going to come all the way back to Michigan from Indonesia. These are two graphs. This is a graph for the pattern of deaths in 1918 due to influenza. This is in our own home state, okay, in Michigan. And there's a similar graph for 1920 when we had a second outbreak in Michigan. And I'll come to that later on in the presentation too. But what is really striking about this is, look at where the bumps are occurring in mortality. They're occurring among people ages 20 to 40, okay? So this is an age group that is very, very different from the age group the more vulnerable age groups for COVID-19, okay? These are people whom you might call being in the prime of their lives. They often have young children. They're out there working. They're not yet in retirement. They're supporting children, helping them grow up and launch them, right? So this is a very, very different type of pandemic demographically. And it has very profoundly different impacts as a consequence on society and the economy, okay? With Indonesia, our data, unfortunately, are much more sparse. I do have a data set which I'm analyzing right now, but let me give you an illustration again from Van Steenis's report. If you look at the Magelang sub-district, right? Of course, you're going to expect, if you go back even to Michigan, you'll see that, you know, infants generally, unfortunately, tend to be vulnerable to any kind of illness, right? They tend to be a very vulnerable population. And infants are disproportionately also affected during the pandemic. What is an anomaly for 1918 is this age group of 20 to 40. And what you see here again is you see that kind of bumping up in mortality rates, right, among these populations in the prime of their lives. And look, it tapers off when you hit the 50 to 59 age category. And then, of course, it goes back up again because you're dealing with elderly populations who are, you know, probably closer to the end of life than some of these younger populations, okay? So here again, you do see that pattern. And Indonesia was affected in much the same manner in which we see Michigan and other countries and other parts of the world being affected. Okay. Now, what was the impact of that? Well, one of the really profound demographic impacts of the 1918 flu, if it was affecting people ages 20 to 40, is these are people who are also reproductively active, right? So one of the real tragedies of the 1918 pandemic was the way in which it affected pregnant women and also their babies born or unborn, right? So what I'm showing you here in these graphs is data that we collected from a variety of locations. The graphs are selected. This is New York State. So the first three graphs are New York State. And the fourth one is Buffalo, New York, for which we happen to find some data. The important point is, remember, there was a wave of influenza in early 1920 in February. And what you see is during that wave, compared to a baseline, which is 1917, when the pandemic hadn't yet arrived, you see this upward blip in deaths from premature birth, right? So these are babies being born prematurely who then are not making it. You see a blip in that during the pandemic, the last pandemic wave. You see the same kind of blip for stillbirths, and we've observed this in Japan and Taiwan as well. This is another real tragedy. These are childbirth-associated deaths. So these are mothers who are dying during the course of childbirth, presumably as a consequence of the influenza. The timing is identical to the timing of the peak. And then here's more. There's actually a spike in premature births and stillbirths as well during the time of one of the major pandemic peaks, which is October 1980. Okay. What is the impact of this on births? Well, these are graphs that show we've kind of seasonally adjusted these data because you have seasonal patterns in births and deaths as well. So the red graphs here, what they show you is excess deaths in different states of the United States. We actually did this exercise for 18 different states, including Michigan. We've just shown 4 of the more heavily populated states at the time. So the 2 red areas that I've circled are spikes in deaths. So these are excess deaths during the pandemic. And you have, of course, the October 19 wave. And as I mentioned, the February 1920 wave, right? The important point here is, I'll make one, there are multiple important implications here for patterns of babies being born. But look at what happens to births. So these are excess births or deficit births. Look at what happens to births 9 months later. You have this massive cratering of births, right? And it's exactly 9 months later, which is, or about 9 months later, which is, as you probably know, the gestation period for a human baby, right? And we don't just see this in New York State, we see it in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts and in Maryland and in fact in Michigan and so on, okay? So it's very clear that the pandemic, the 1918 influenza pandemic was accompanied by a massive dip in births 9 months later. But there were also baby booms that followed, okay, to make up, at least in part, for this deficit in births. If you go to Google and you type in COVID-19 and births, you'll see that there is an incredible amount of interest in what the COVID-19 pandemic has done to patterns of babies being born, okay? So again, some very interesting parallels. Okay, so what are some of the questions we can ask about the COVID-19 pandemic? Has it affected different demographic groups differently? This is a rhetorical question. We know age-wise it has, but what about gender impacts, right? We know that in the case of the 1918 flu, pregnant women were hit particularly hard. We don't have a clear picture as to what the story is with COVID-19. It seems like that may not be the case, certainly to as great a degree as was the case in 1918, okay? But effects on families you're going to have, right? So even though in 1918, it was people 20 to 40 who were dying, leaving potentially young orphans, of which there are many, many examples, and causing all kinds of upheaval in, the marriage market or whatever you want to call it, right? Over here, because it's more elderly people, they also have families, right? And so the demographic and often will play a caretaking role with children, right? So you are going to have some very significant disruptions on families as a consequence of this demographic distortion in mortality patterns during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, let's move on to public health. Laura, this one's for you and for anybody else who's interested in public health, obviously in the room. I'm actually going to skip the epidemiology concept part. I might come back to it. But let's talk a little bit about the scientific and historical context. Remember, 1918 and 2020 are totally different times scientifically, right? In 1918, the cause of influenza had not been conclusively established, okay? People were still not sure whether they were dealing with a virus or a bacterium as the causative agent. In fact, there was widespread suspicion that a bacterium called Pfeiffer's bacillus was in fact responsible for influenza. Today, we know that that's not the case. It is in fact a virus which is much smaller and harder to detect. But the Pfeiffer's bacillus, by the way, is the Haemophilus influenzae B bacterium against which children today, it is recommended that children be vaccinated. And what was essentially happening during the 1918 pandemic is people were getting infected by the virus. And very often, as a consequence of the viral infection, the bacterium, it gave the bacterium an opportunity to reproduce and to cause bacterial pneumonia. That was very often a lethal complication of the 1918 flu. Okay, so that's really what was happening in many, many cases in 1918. Today, of course, that would be less of a problem because we know how to deal with bacteria. Viruses, not so much yet. We're getting there, but we're not there yet. Okay. As a consequence of this lack of understanding, the means of spread were not really that well understood in 1918. And certainly there was no question of a vaccine, right? There was this virus, you just had to deal with it one way or another and hope it went away at some point, right? And that, of course, is a totally different situation from what we have today, because today, within a few weeks of the infection coming along, we'd actually sequenced the entire genome of the virus, and teams all over the world were already beginning to think about strategies to inoculate against the virus and to prevent it, and in some cases, to even potentially defeat it using various types of pharmaceutical interventions, okay? So in 1918, as a consequence, what are the policy interventions that we see? These are actually detailed in a few documents, and if Professor Nancy Florida is in the room, she'll recognize La Lara Influenza. So this is actually a Javanese language play, which she very kindly and beautifully translated, and we hope will be published soon one day. It's actually a story in the wayang tradition. So this is it's the puppet tradition of Indonesia, in which you have heroes, these mythological heroes who go on all kinds of quests and adventures and try to do the right thing, thereby providing lessons for us. Well, what the Dutch authorities and the dalangs, or the puppet masters who actually do these puppet performances, came up with was a story in that tradition that involved some of the heroes with which the public in Java would have been familiar. And they actually wrote a play called La Lara Influenza, which talks about how strategies for combating the influenza pandemic are obtained from other mythological characters, and then they actually listed out in the course of this play and disseminated to the public in the form of a wayang performance. I should mention, and if I have time, I might even put a link in the chat box later on, that the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan, and thank you, Laura, for this, and MSU's Asian Studies Center collaborated to sponsor a revival of this long sort of dormant play, which had probably last been enacted in the 1920s, just a few weeks ago. And it's now available in English with English subtitles. It's available for viewing on YouTube. So I'll try to pop that link in. It is a little bit long, so budget a few hours if you want to watch the whole thing. But this is basically a reenactment with a modern interpretation of this document. The other big document is the Influenza Ordinance, which is the Influenza Ordinance. Both of these documents, by the way, the publications that we've seen have the date of 1920 on them, unfortunately, which is after the pandemic has done its worst. But the Influenza Ordinance is basically it's a body of legislation that focuses on things like quarantine. So, if a ship has an infected person on board, there are certain things it must do. You're not allowed to bring people on shore. You've got to fly certain flags. You've got to give out all kinds of indications that people shouldn't come close. It also has some prescriptions for what to do in other areas where people gather, like schools. Okay. Let me move to the Michigan experience. This is still on the theme of public health, but I'm coming close to the end of the talk. So I'm going to skip this epidemiology stuff unless somebody really wants me to talk about it during the Q&A section. But this is, we looked at the number of deaths between 1918 and 1920 in Michigan, and we calculated excess deaths. And we came up with a very interesting finding, which a few people might have recognized in other contexts in the past, but we don't think it ever been properly characterized. So what happens in Michigan during the pandemic, these are waves of excess deaths. You get an initial wave early in the spring of 1918, and it's actually a pretty bad wave, and it's noticeable and it's reported in the media, but it goes away and people heave a sigh of relief and say, wow, that was really bad, but at least it's over. Little knowing that a few months later, a massive wave, the famous October 1918 wave, is going to come along, right? Now, you get this peak in a lot of counties of Michigan. And as a consequence, the governor at the time, Albert Sleeper, he says, I'm going to put in place a ban on social gatherings. And he does that, okay? And what the ban does is it brings the wave down. But unfortunately, and this should all sound very, very familiar to everybody in the room today, there's a lot of pressure, economic pressure from businesses and other entities that are kind of losing out because of this lockdown to reopen the economy. And so the ban is actually lifted. The ban on social gatherings is lifted about 3 weeks later. And what happens? You get a little second bump in some of the counties where there are still susceptible people, right? And this horrific wave actually goes away. And then everybody says, okay, that was really bad. And now we're done with it. And unfortunately, the answer is no, you're not done with it, because in early 1920, the pandemic rears its ugly head again, and you get a massive wave. And this spike is in fact the single largest spike that Michigan experiences in the entire pandemic, okay? So this is a very sobering finding that we made that tells us that it wasn't really the 1918 pandemic in Michigan. It was the 1918 to 1920 pandemic. And we need to understand this pandemic, at least here, as having been a 2-year pandemic and not just, a 1918 pandemic, okay? There are other very interesting questions here. Why did we get this sudden spike in 1920? Was it a variant of the virus that somehow was able to dodge the immune systems of people who had been previously infected? Or was it just that the influenza infection, the immunity only lasts so long, and after a while, you're susceptible again to an infection, okay? Very interesting questions to ask in the context of the 1918 H1 influenza. I'm going to wrap up in about 5 minutes because we're coming to the end of the hour, close to the end of the hour. But here, what I want to show you is some of the very interesting spatial phenomena that we see. So over here, these graphs show the excess deaths in 4 heavily populated counties in Michigan. The dark kind of brown line up here, this is Wayne County, this is Detroit. This is folks in Ann Arbor, the red line. The light kind of chestnut brown color is Ingham County. That's us at Michigan State. And the yellow line is Kent County, which is Grand Rapids, okay? And what's really fascinating about this is you see that Detroit and Ann Arbor are among the early places to get the wave. And when Governor Sleeper imposes his ban, those 2 waves come crashing down and more or less stabilize, okay? So the wave comes in at the right time, maybe a little bit late for Detroit and Ann Arbor, and basically helps to bring the pandemic under control, whatever's left of it. With Ingham County, it's a different story. And remember, we're in the middle of the state, okay? So we may very well have got our infections from the more populous eastern side of the state. Ingham County is going up when the ban is imposed. We come back down, the ban is lifted, and guess what happens? We get a double bump, right? And so in some senses, inadvertently, Governor Sleeper may have actually helped flatten our curve or smooth it out over 2 waves optimally in some ways. And then for Kent County, of course, Kent hardly even has a wave going before it gets its ban. And so when the ban is lifted, you've got all these susceptible people out there. And now the virus gets to come roaring in and creates a massive wave in Kent County or Grand Rapids. Okay. So this is the 1918, October and December, that double bump that you saw, right? This double bump over here. That's what you're seeing in this figure. In this figure, you're seeing what happens in 1920. And remember, in 1920, what do we have? We have one huge steep spike, no double bumps over here. And what we see is that wave hits all of Michigan essentially at the same time. And it's short and it's sharp and everything happens everywhere at the same time. It's not, there isn't this sense of motion from, one side of the state to the other. It's everything at the same time. I have maps to show this, but we don't have time. Okay, and so the final topic that I'm going to look at is, this age signature business is quite a fascinating business. If pandemic viruses tend to come in and disproportionately affect people in different age groups, right? We know that death data are often collected in a more reliable manner. In most of the world, the United States is an exception. We are a very privileged exception. In most of the world, there isn't widespread testing, okay? Most governments around the world have very little idea about how bad it is in different locations at different points in time, okay? But what most of them do reasonably well is they do collect data from here and there on who is dying and some details about, including at what age did they die, okay? And so one of the observations we've made is that, when you have periods of high pandemic activity in which you have a lot of excess mortality, right? To the extent that you can look at the distribution of deaths across age groups, the distortions that carry the signature of the pandemic. In the case of 1918, people ages 20 to 40, you're going to see a bulge there. In the case of the COVID-19, you're going to see a distortion above the 65-year-old age group, right? There's going to be a bump over there in the distribution. You could potentially use this as a surveillance strategy to try to figure out what's going on in different locations around the world without having to give people expensive, PCR tests and so on, which a lot of countries can't afford. Okay. So in the case of just to give you a recap, in the case of Michigan, it's people ages 20 to 40 who are dying in disproportionate numbers, right? This is sort of the same graph that I showed you earlier in red. It's not a weekly graph, so you don't have that clean bump, double bump, but you do see these 4 peaks, okay? Now, what I'm going to show you next is a graph that tells you how distorted, it's a measure of how distorted the distribution of deaths across age groups is compared to what you'd expect in normal years, okay? So keep in mind, when you have a peak in pandemic-related deaths, you would expect that distortion in the age distribution to also be high, right? And guess what we see? This is the measure of distortion in the distribution of deaths. It's a simple, for those who've done introductory statistics, one way to compare distributions to each other is to use a chi-square statistic. That's one of the graphs here. And then one is a slightly less well-known, but very good distortion statistic. The really fascinating thing about this is how closely this graph matches, this distortion in age distribution graph matches the number of excess deaths that we observe in Michigan, okay? And so we took this, I'm not going to go over this. These are actually some of the key months when the deaths were happening in 1918. I'm going to skip that by. But we said, okay, if that's happening in the case of the 1918 pandemic, which has an age signature, what about COVID-19? Okay, so here is a graph where the green line shows you the number of reported deaths due to COVID-19 in the entire United States. And this red kind of jagged graph shows you how distorted the distribution of deaths across ages is for each one of those weeks. These are weekly distributions. And what you'll see is the two graphs are moving in lockstep, right? Another way to look at it is to look at the number of reported deaths, right, on the same scatter plot as how distorted your distribution is. And this is an incredibly tight relationship, okay? You have a correlation for those who know statistics or no correlations of 0.9, which is very, very, very high, okay? So this has led us to propose in a paper that will be coming out soon, I hope, I think in January, that you can actually look at this age structure of mortality, and you don't need to do COVID tests necessarily to get a reasonably accurate picture of how bad COVID is in a location or how bad it was, okay? And so I'm going to end there because we need a little time for Q&A. There's about 15 minutes. Here are some of the themes that I've covered during this presentation. It's part of a larger project that we've been doing on the 1918 pandemic for the last decade or so. It's been a collaborative project with students and faculty from MSU and other places. These are some of the publications we've done. We've looked at Asia primarily because the United States is a very well-studied area, and so are many countries in Western Europe. but we found that there were huge gaps in Asia, and in some instances, good enough data that you could actually make sense of the 1918 pandemic. And this is the reason I chose Indonesia in part because I did my PhD on Indonesia, and it's always been a country that fascinates me. It's also of particular interest to people who study epidemics because it's an island nation, and islands are epidemiologically very, very interesting entities. So I'll stop there. If we can, shall we go to Q&A?
Thank you so much, Siddharth. I hear a lot of applauding all over. Yes, we can go to Q&A, and I'm happy to start. I did want to note, I didn't realize your excess desk paper was from 2018. So at some point, we'll have to have you here on campus to have lunch with everybody and talk about how that pandemic unfolded for you, for somebody that studies the pandemic. It must have been fascinating.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, maybe quickly, because I realize this will probably be hours. But yeah, for somebody who studies this, coming up and watching it move across the world.
And let me preface my response by saying the University of Michigan has a wonderful team that's worked on the history of the pandemic in the United States. It has a wonderful website. Just Google University of Michigan 1918 pandemic. An amazingly rich collection of newspaper articles that actually informed us and that we've cited in our papers on Michigan. So there is a wonderful resource in Ann Arbor for those of you who are interested in the 1918 pandemic. For me personally, Laura, it's been probably the most bizarre experience in my life, right? Because, you're studying an event for the love of it, right? It's something that interests you, that is quite fascinating historically. For 10 years, you've delved into it, you've looked at many different countries, and then one fine day, it happens all over again. The parallels are they are everywhere to be seen. Age distortion, right? Lockdowns, pressure to relax lockdowns, social distancing measures, have your chicken soup. Lallara Influenza is talking about, that Javanese play is talking about having hot cooked broths, to kind of stave off the effects. The parallels are just everywhere. And so that was one really bizarre aspect of the pandemic. And the other was, you're sitting quietly in your corner doing it, and suddenly it felt like the whole world showed up, the phone was ringing off the hook, the media was suddenly interested. It was just, it was surreal. I think surreal is really the word.
Yeah, I think we'll all be trying to recover from this for years, but I can't imagine studying this, watching this unfold, and with some of the parallels you're pointing out. And we do have quite a few questions on Indonesia and just in general on some of your data. And one is from Elizabeth Osborne, who asked if you considered revisiting the mortality trends to account for the size of population by age. There were very few people alive aged 45 or older, equivalent to our 65 and older in modern times in Indonesia, the US. And the mortality rate per size of population is likely closer to that to what we are observing today. So in raw, in raw numbers, however, the mortality of people of working age, as you point out, was a huge loss worldwide.
Yeah, that's just a wonderful question. As somebody who's sort of worked in the demographic realm, the unfortunate answer is in the case of Indonesia, no. And here's the reason. Mm-hmm. The first real census of Indonesia was only conducted in 1920. And it was a pretty weak census, okay? And so, you're lucky if you can rely on head counts of data when a census like that is conducted. That's about as far as I've gone with that census, the 1920 census. The first good census was conducted in 1930, right? And so, unfortunately, we are far enough away by that time from the pandemic that you don't have much of a baseline prior to the pandemic with which to think about how many people in different age groups are around, right? What you're seeing is the ex post, sort of the consequences of the pandemic about 12 years later. So my answer is I really, really wish it were possible. I don't think it is. In fact, I'm pretty certain it is not possible to do it with any semblance of accuracy.
Yeah, it's always the bane to not have your denominator, right, of any kind of demography study.
Yeah, unfortunately. Which is why I focus
So-
on the questions I have, right? You have to ask
Yeah.
what is feasible and what is not, right? So spatial spread is feasible. Let me elaborate a little. So, when you're talking
please.
about mortality waves, right? I can't really tell you with any degree of certainty exactly how many people or even close to how many people would have died during each of those waves in each of the locations. But timing, I think, is a little more reliable. When it's spiking, whether they're underreporting by 50% or 80% or only 10%, it's still the spike, right? So I place a lot more faith in being able to tease out timing issues and location issues than I do the specifics of the how manys, which is one reason why I'm very tentative about anything to do with how many.
So our friend Theo Cyprus from the Midwest Institute is asking, thank you for the informative presentation. Hi, Theo. I want you to comment on stratification in Indonesia or the United States regarding economic classes in 1918 or the to 20 pandemic.
Yeah, that's a great question. And hello, Theo, how are you? Thank you for coming. So, with Indonesia, again, the best stratification we can do is something, by looking at something like this figure, right? We know that people in Amsterdam are European. It's a relatively wealthy country, right? And we know that the outcomes are better. We know that in Java, it's predominantly Javanese, and outcomes are relatively worse. The question that you ask about whether there was stratification within Java, it turns out that we do have, I think, decent statistics for Europeans as well. So it's something that we could potentially compare with these data for Javanese. There is a question about whether the sample sizes, the numbers of Europeans are large enough, because the Dutch East Indies was ruled by an incredibly thin veneer of Dutch at the top of the hierarchy, a slightly thicker layer of people, other Asians or whatever you want to call that racial category, and then a huge mass of people of sort of, indigenous sort of descent, right? Javanese descent in this case. But I think it probably is possible to do that, in comparison to data like this. So that's a very good question, and I think it's something that needs to be done. I should say we've just done a study like this for British India, and we found that in British India, Indian soldiers in the British India Army were 2.5 times as likely to die of the influenza as were British soldiers in the British India Army. We know for Army, the data are pretty good. It's a controlled group and people are counting. And we know that over there, it was about 2.5 times as bad for Indians as it was for British. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the only thing I've seen that's similar are some of the cholera maps that show that it's spreading out, cholera is spreading out from the shipping areas and the ports. But I haven't, so there isn't anything probably that's similar outside of what you've done for influenza, I imagine.
Right.
Monique Van Reenen, who is one of our PhD students here in anthropology that studies Indonesia, she says that she's seen a lot of distrust among Indonesians, predominantly conservative Muslim groups, of how the government is handling the COVID-19 pandemic. Many reject vaccinations on several bases, namely mostly Sinovac, which is largely wrapped up in anti-Chinese sentiments and questions as to whether certain vaccines are halal, and spread misinformation through social media networks that denounce evidence-based science and promote questionable alternatives. In what ways do you see contemporary media networks affecting the pandemic mitigation effects in ways that were obviously impossible in 1918? I think she's speaking specifically about Indonesia.
Well, that's such a good, when I talked about how the world is different today compared to before, I was focusing on vaccines and science and biology. But you're absolutely right. Public health and messaging is incredibly important, which is why, the authorities, along with the Dalangs who probably collaborated, published that play, right? It was to educate the public with do's and don'ts. I personally think that actually, unfortunately, what social media and the internet has done is it's at a much more basic level created a polarized society, which has, I think, primed certain segments of the population to be much more resistant to or much less open to, if you will, to what I think are really well-proven, solid methods to combat the pandemic, right? That was happening in the Dutch East Indies as well, but to a much smaller degree. And the reason is that the control, if you will, of the messaging was quite firmly in the hands of the colonial authorities, right? If there was anything approaching social media, it was primarily in the hands of the colonial authorities. So I think that has actually had a devastating effect on pandemic outcomes today. Let me extend that. I gave an interview to a leading Indian newspaper last year, saying that I did not expect that COVID-19 outcomes would approach the severity of the 1918 flu outcomes. And I did it under the assumption that people would listen to what I think is reason and science, and the fact that we had a vaccine in the wings, which we did, right? And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. So I was, of course, speaking in the context of India, which I think will actually do much better this time around, because I think society is perhaps a little less polarized on the subject of the science. And I think people generally have a tendency to be a little more compliant there and a little more trusting of the government, for better or for worse, right? I think in the case of India, we'll have better outcomes. In the case of the US, we already have had more deaths attributable to COVID-19 than we ever did for the 1918 influenza, which was about 675,000. Now, you can still argue that in percentage terms, we're doing better today than we did in 1918, and that's true. And I hope that at the very least, at least on that score, we do better during the current pandemic.
So we have a lot of great questions, and I want to be attentive to time, so I'll ask one more and just let you know that, Siddharth, I know you're happy if people contact you independently.
Sure.
And talk a little bit. I thought a nice one to end on is Apachai Sunchinada, who is an independent expert on Thailand and recently had some reflections comparing the COVID pandemic with the Black Death pandemic in the 14th century. The latter is significant, especially in the European context, as the continent transitioned from the Middle or Dark Ages to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. So this person's asking, from a philosophical point of view, would the COVID pandemic lead humanity to a Renaissance 2.0 or new normal in that light? Any view from your knowledge of 1918 pandemic and then what you see with COVID?
Well, you know, Laura, we're actually living through a huge change, a huge societal change. And you know, one very overt manifestation of it is what we're doing right now, okay? You know, this technology, the Zoom technology and you know, all these other types of, you know, social sort of distance, you know, communication technologies have been available to us for a very, very long time, right? It's only the shock of a pandemic that forced us all to stay home and rethink how we worked and how we lived life that has caused us to adopt this wholesale, right? But now we see the benefits, right? So I'll give you one example in our relatively narrow academic sphere. So of course, you know, over here at Michigan State and probably at the University of Michigan, it's unlikely that we're going to return to 5 days a week in the office working patterns again, right? I think that shift has happened and it's unlikely we're going to revert. The benefits for that are enormous, right? It's easier for me to find parking on campus now. I'm giving you very narrow benefits, but very profound ones. It's easier for me to find parking. I'm burning less gas. It's so less environmental degradation. It's costing me less, so I have more disposable income for whatever else I want to do. I'm spending less time in my life, and if you add it up over your life, commuting takes a bite out of your life, right? I'm spending less time sitting in the car, just getting from point A to point B, right? My quality of life is greatly enhanced because I have so much more flexibility now. I can get more work done if I want to, but I don't have to. And I'm in close proximity to certain members of my family, which is fantastic. You know, I can take a 5-minute tea break with my family if I want to between meetings. Amazing. And this is just my own little narrow sphere and what immediately pops into my mind, right? So there's going to be a massive change. If I may, I'll give you one more example. You know, the American Institute for Indonesian Studies just held a conference in June. This was a virtual conference because that's the way it had to be, right? We didn't know how many people to expect to come along, right? We thought maybe 150, 200 people. We had 500 people show up, okay? And 250 approximately of those people were from Indonesia. And the other 250 were from 20 plus other countries, including predominantly the United States, okay? Now, we kept the fee structure low, so people who were from lower income categories and a lot of junior scholars very often in both countries can't afford to go to a conference that's going to cost them $1,500 total, right? These were voices that entered into the conversation, and young Indonesian voices, right? And young American and young other international voices. I think as a consequence, the conversation was that much more vibrant and the exchange of ideas that much more comprehensive, right? So now think about if that's happening in Indonesian studies, right? Where else is it happening? And what is it doing to ideation and to communication, right? So to answer your question, the changes are going to be profound. We're going to be talking about this for decades as a real threshold in society.
Well, I even think even with the cholera pandemics in the 17 and 1800s, those led to the World Health Organization understanding of how disease wasn't due to moral failure. So, and just looking at the social change over the last year. And, I hate to say this, we had a few more questions, and Syamsul, it's one of our MIR students, and I could put you in touch with Siddharth Syamsul, he's from Indonesia and has the really good insights on government measures. But with that, again, I'll pass these along. Zombies. Apachai saying, now we're zombies. Absolutely. So I will release all of you. And thank Siddharth so much again for coming and talking to us in this really vibrant conversation, and hopefully to be continued as you come to campus and we could talk a little bit more about these effects, which are fascinating. And thank you so much for your fascinating talk. Thank you everybody for attending our CEAS webinar today, with a reminder that our next one is a Monday morning webinar, a week from Monday. So please check your calendars for that roundtable. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you everybody for coming. And yeah, please do stay in touch. And if you've got something to present on Asia, let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And